Hey friends, and welcome to my series on executive function foundations, how to help students who struggle with executive function skills. My name is Sean McCormick. I am a former public school special education teacher turned executive function specialist. And today I'm going to be walking you through the 3 key reasons as to why students struggle with these skills. Let's jump into it. So why do students struggle with these skills? Well, it's biology, environment, and the daily wear and tear as the 3 culprits for why students struggle with these. And if you're not familiar with this or just jumping in right now, this is part of my Executive Functions Foundations, which is a free professional development series for educators who want to learn how to help students with ADHD, autism, traumatic brain injury, and other executive function challenges learn how to support these skills. So if you're in a district where they can't afford it, you can watch this whole series of videos to check this out and get up to date on best practices. So let's jump into the 3 root causes for executive dysfunction, which are biological or developmental causes, situational or environmental causes, and the daily wear and tear. So when we look at neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and dyslexia, they all have biological roots. So, for example, acquired brain injury like TBI, strokes, these things cause damage to the frontal lobe and related pathways, making it difficult for students to potentially plan out or emotionally regulate. Additionally, genetics or neurotransmitter imbalances that are hereditary or developed through lifestyle can also impact executive functioning. Now, I'm going to share a couple studies with you. The links to those are below in the you can see here if you want to look these up yourselves. But this is a study from Cambridge University Press, and they found that brain development in preschoolers with ADHD was evident. So basically, they found that, and I'll actually give you a quote from the study. A study of preschoolers with ADHD found reductions in gray matter volume in children with ADHD relative to typically developing children, which means certain parts of the brain that of these preschool students weren't as developed as their neurotypical peers. And they also connected these or lagging brain developments to things like inhibition or ability to stay on task or self-regulate. So these are very real physical changes in the brain that even preschoolers with ADHD have or experience or have. Additionally, there was a recent study, I think it was in 2024 or 2025 actually, where researchers at Yale School of Medicine discovered molecular differences in autistic brains. And here's a snippet from the study. They found that a study of brains of autistic adults have fewer synapses, meaning junctions where nerve cells send signals to and from each other, than the brains of neurotypical people. Now, they don't know if the reason for this is because they were born that way or because of a lack of potential social interactions or other factors related to autism caused this to occur. But we do know that there are fewer synapses, which impacts executive functioning. Now, one way to think of this is Dr. Russell Barkley's widely cited 30% rule. And his idea here is that individuals with ADHD operate at approximately 30% behind their chronological age in emotional and self-regulation skills. So this guideline has been developed to help people understand the struggles of students with executive function challenges. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so I can show you this. This is actually from Dr. Barkley's book, Executive Functions. So if you want to check that out, that can be really helpful in terms of understanding how to support students with these skills. We'll jump back over to the slides here. And this is a diagram I just pulled from online. So thank you to ot4adhd.com for providing this. I found it on Google Images. But they broke down like, what does this actually mean if a student's 30% behind their peers in terms of executive skill development? So for example, if they're 17 or 18 years old, they might be functioning like a 12-year-old, right? Or a 6th to 7th grader. So having this understanding can help us be more empathetic and more skilled at developing strategies, differentiation, scaffolds for students who might be a bit farther behind their peers in terms of neurological development of their brains. Okay, now there's also environmental causes that cause executive dysfunction. So early trauma or neglect, such as abuse during childhood, can interfere with the proper development of higher order executive functions. If you're not sure about higher order executive functions, go back to the first video in this series where I talk about what are executive function skills, what are the cognitive processes, what part of the brain they develop in. That's going to help you understand that further. And Harvard's University's Center on Developing Child shared this quote: "If children do not get what they need from their relationship with adults and the conditions in their environment, or worse, if those influences are sources of toxic stress, their skill development can be seriously delayed or impaired." I think this is a pretty foundational quote on understanding what helps EF skills develop and also what impairs them. But really, predictable, routine-based support and care is essential for kids to develop these executive function skills. And I share this additionally because it's important to understand that if you want to develop executive function skills, it's not just about one lesson plan where you teach about executive functioning. It's about creating an environment and routines where these skills can flourish and develop. So let's jump back over to the slides here. So this is a diagram from California's ACEs studies, which is Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And they found that toxic stress or intense, prolonged, repeated, and unaddressed stress that activates the body's stress response without the buffering presence of a supportive adult can be very damaging to humans, right? Now, if we look at the study of ACEs and show like what are the most damaging or most frequently occurring adverse childhood experiences, the top one is emotional or verbal abuse. So in California, 61% of adults have experienced at least 1 in 6 of ACEs, with the top one being emotional or verbal abuse in California adults. Okay, and then here you can see that almost 40% of adults in California have experienced 1 or 0 ACEs, but these are the breakdown of amount of ACEs per adult group here. So jumping over here, I want to go back to the definition of ADHD from the DSM-5, which says often fails to give close attention to detail or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork. Now I'm calling out the DSM-5 here because when they say something like makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, it directly feeds into this, directly feeds into this idea that students with ADHD, autism, students who struggle with executive dysfunction are careless or don't care or need to try harder, when this is in fact not the case. Now, my colleague Jessica McCabe, who makes the channel How to ADHD, she's talked about how executive function challenges are not a needs to try harder situation. It's a lack of environmental modifications. It's a lack of understanding how their brain develops, which is what we're trying to explain here. So really, this kind of low-level emotional abuse of students with executive function challenges is one of the causes to why they feel unincluded and unsupported in the school system at many times. So what can we do? Well, first we have to understand what happens to the brain of a student when they start to feel stressed out, when they start to feel labeled as careless or doesn't try hard enough, when they're really giving their full effort, right? So they go from this ventral vagal nervous system flow to potentially sympathetic, and then up into this fight, flight, or freeze, or the dorsal vagal nervous system, which is where their executive function skills cannot be accessed. Now, here's what that looks like in the brain. So when the brain is functioning properly, you can see here in this image that information and signals are being relayed from the prefrontal cortex across the brain to different parts, like the striatum, which helps us navigate and manage habits and behaviors, to different parts of the brain, right? But what happens when people or students are stressed out is that this channel that is closed and sending signals across is opened up. And what happens is basically the production of dopamine and norepinephrine, I always have a hard time pronouncing that, but the signal is lost. So instead of these signals being passed across the brain, the channel opens and the signal is lost. So students can't really use their prefrontal cortex. And then they go into the emotional core where compulsive behaviors, basically not thinking, happens, and they get very stressed and are unable to use their executive skills. Now, another way to imagine this is when the unstressed brain is functioning properly, the prefrontal cortex is sending signals across the brain, right? When the brain is stressed, it's focused on this amygdala, the hypothalamus. The prefrontal cortex is shut off. We go into that kind of fight, flight, or freeze or fawn persona, and we're unable to use our executive skills. Now, over time, this can really negatively impact brain development. Chris Hansen of Life Skills Advocate created a great diagram here, the EF ripple effect. And what happens is if they have a stressful situation, maybe they miss a deadline or they don't do something correctly, yes, that has an immediate consequence, right? But it leads to secondary consequences like they don't want to take risks, they don't feel comfortable coming to class, they feel stuck, which leads to anxiety, low self-esteem, less dependence. And this takes us back to that bigger picture diagram I shared earlier, where executive function skills impact the entire lifespan, right? Not only do they impact school, but when we look at the study of Dr. Adele Diamond, which I shared in an earlier video, we can see that the entire quality of life is impacted by this executive function ripple effect, which makes it so important to teach these skills, to teach self-awareness so that students can self-direct. So jumping back over to the slides here, what happens to the brain over time is that when that prefrontal cortex gets shut off, the brain structurally remodels. So the prefrontal cortex atrophies or weakens, the amygdala hypertrophies or gets stronger, but then later atrophies because it can't sustain this level of intensity or stress over long periods of time. And if you expand this to a larger scale, this is the diagram of someone who's experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. You can see that the hippocampal volume of the brain has actually decreased in the patient with extreme post-traumatic stress, right? So the brain actually changes over time and reshapes itself when it's experiencing too much stress. That's pretty crazy. And that just makes me realize we have to address these skills, right? So I hope that helps you kind of understand the big picture here. Okay, so jumping back over to the slide deck. The last one is the daily wear and tear that impacts executive functioning. So the first part of this is decision fatigue. And the best way to explain this is through a story about, they actually did a study on judges who had prisoners who were trying to apply for parole and what happened. So I'll show you that. But to start, it's estimated that the American adult makes 35,000 decisions per day. Right? So of course, not all of these are conscious, right? We're making unconscious decisions or subconscious decisions throughout the day in terms of like where to go and what to do and what to eat and when to use the bathroom and things like that. But throughout the day, we're making tons of decisions. Now, there was a study that examined over 1,000 judicial rulings across a 10-month period. And these rulings were made by a parole board judge who was determining whether or not to allow a criminal to be released from prison on parole. And in this study, they found that the proportion of favorable decisions decreased over time, right? So the day started with the judges making a lot of favorable decisions, but then slowly less and less favorable decisions until these dotted lines represent a food break, right? At which point there were more favorable decisions made by the judges, which is really crazy and really scary, right? If you ever get a traffic ticket, make sure you're one of the first people there. And this study shows that a criminal was much more likely to get a favorable response if their parole hearing was scheduled in the morning or after a food break than it was if it was scheduled near the end of a long session. Now, this is just so wild to think about, right? Like right now, what we're seeing here is that basically someone could end up in jail if they get their parole hearing near the end of a judge's day or right before a food break. If that doesn't happen, they're more likely to go to jail. So this is really scary, but it's also really important to implicate not only in the education system, but in the criminal justice system. We need to understand executive functioning and how it not only impacts people and criminals or people who have been convicted of crimes, but also the people who are charged with supporting and enforcing them. All right, but coming back over to the focus of this, which is the education piece, let's jump back into here. So what does this mean for you and your students? Well, try to schedule the most challenging classes at the beginning of the day when students' cognition is freshest. Work on challenging assignments before cognition exhaustion at the beginning of class, and utilize breaks strategically to support students. Now, I'm going to do a little activity here with you. I learned this from Tara Sumter. I was reading some of her content, and I thought this was such a great activity. I wanted to share this with you. And I will share with you, if you do want to check out Tara's work, she has a website and a blog, and you can do that, and also share with you her book right here. So this is Tara's book. It's called The Seeds of Learning. Awesome book. Check it out if you want to really deep dive into executive functioning. But jumping back over here to the slide deck, let's go into this little activity, which is Pick something you would like to hold in your mind, special memory, scene from a movie, favorite food, whatever it is. And I want you to try to focus on it for 1 minute. And on a post-it note or a journal nearby, make a note each time your mind drifts, okay? So if you're watching this video, pause it right here after I share this and drop in the chat box what you discover. Or if you're running this as a PD for your staff, you can pause it here. And what we'll do here is I'll jump over the next slide. So basically, you're going to do it for 1 minute, and then we're going to do a little turn and talk after. So pause the video now. Okay, unpause it and keep going here. So I want you to turn and talk or drop in the comments below. Were you able to stay focused on one thing for the whole minute? How many times did your mind drift? Now, the big idea there is that students are expected to stay focused all day, right? They have maybe 6 to 7 different classes. They've got their cell phones on them. They're in very chaotic or, busy environments. And imagine if it's hard for you as an adult to stay on track, how hard it's going to be for them. So we really have to build in breaks, food breaks, opportunities for them to stretch, to refresh their cognition in order to help keep them on track. Okay, so now let's talk about the final piece, which is the amino acids and protein deficiency, which impacts executive functioning. So amino acids are essential for the central nervous system to function, right? They're the building blocks of the brain, and they become chemical messengers that control thoughts and moods, right? So neurotransmitters convey signals between the prefrontal cortex and the other parts of their brain to regulate behaviors and emotions. Okay, now going back to this diagram I shared earlier, right? The neurotransmitters are responsible for conveying signals across these channels, right? When the channel is closed, they can send it across the brain to places like the striatum, which regulates behavior. But when those neurotransmitters are lacking or are not funded, I would say, by amino acids, there's going to be challenges, right? And this is a diagram of different neurological conditions such as autism, schizophrenia, and it shows the associated amino acids that are necessary or contribute to the impact of these different diseases. So all this is to say, it's really important for students and adults to have the proper amino acids, which begs the question, where do we get amino acids? So I've shared this diagram with you, but really rich, organic foods, like things like avocados, spinach, nuts, fruits, vegetables, fish, these things are what allow students and adults to have those amino acid building blocks, which allows for proper brain functioning, right? And we all know, what are students eating all day? What are you eating? We got to ask ourselves, what are we eating? Because if we're eating things like Cheetos and chips and lots of carbs and sodas, our brains are not going to work as effectively. We don't have those amino acids, which are carrying information across those different parts of the brain. So make sure you and your kids are eating the right stuff as much as you can. Okay, jumping back over here. So that is the big ideas behind what causes executive dysfunction. It has root causes related to genetics and brain development, but also related to those daily challenges. Understanding the differences in brains can lead to more empathy for students with special needs, because as we shared earlier in here, there are physical brain differences in preschoolers with ADHD compared to their neurotypical peers. And brain functioning can be improved through breaks, healthy diets, and other small tweaks. Okay, so now if you're watching this, the turn and talk question is, how do you explain to parents or other educators who think a student who is trying doesn't care or needs to try harder? So what could you say to them? So I want you to pause here and either drop it in the comment section below, or if you're running a PD with your staff, share this amongst yourself. Take 3 to 5 minutes to talk about this, and then we'll move on. All right, so if you want to go further with this and you're just watching for now, you can check out the free staff toolkit and discussion prompts that can be downloaded from the description below. And if you want to bring this to your school district, whether it's through an online webinar or through a full day in-person professional development training, request a workshop in the description below. I would love to chat with you about this further. In the next video, we're going to talk about what is the reticular activating system and how to use this thing that's known as the brain's bouncer to stay focused on goals, and how you can help your students develop these skills. I hope this video is helpful. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video, and stay functioning.